Imagine waking up tomorrow speaking fluent ancient Sanskrit. You've never studied it, never heard it, yet you're conversing in a dead language you shouldn't know. Or suffering a head injury and suddenly speaking perfect German. You're American. You've never left the country. But now you speak German with a Berlin accent, fluently, naturally. This isn't science fiction, it's documented medical phenomenon. Xenoglossy, sudden linguistic acquisition, foreign accent syndrome, people speaking languages they never learned, languages they've never been exposed to, some speaking dead languages that require years of academic study. Neurologists are puzzled. Linguists verify the accuracy. Psychologists document the cases. But no one can fully explain how the human brain suddenly accesses linguistic information it never acquired. I'm Detective Vera Nash, and I've investigated 10 cases where people woke up speaking languages they couldn't possibly know. Case number 1. The Jensen Case. 1955, Philadelphia. A woman known as T.E. in the medical literature, later identified as Laura. She volunteered for hypnotic regression experiments conducted by her husband. The goal was exploring past life memories. The result was unexpected linguistic phenomenon. Under hypnosis, Laura began speaking Swedish, not modern Swedish, an older dialect. She identified herself as Jensen Jacobi, a Swedish peasant who lived centuries earlier. She spoke fluently, conversationally, with proper grammar and period-appropriate vocabulary. The problem: Laura had never studied Swedish, never been exposed to the language, grew up in a monolingual English-speaking household. No Swedish ancestry, no access to Swedish language materials. Yet under hypnosis, she spoke fluent Swedish, verified by native speakers. The sessions were recorded. Linguists analyzed the recordings. The Swedish was genuine, grammar correct, vocabulary authentic. The dialect matched historical Swedish from the region and period Jensen Jacobi claimed to have lived. This wasn't mimicry or random sounds. This was actual language with proper structure. Skeptics proposed cryptomnesia. Perhaps Laura had been exposed to Swedish as a child and forgotten. The memory surfaced under hypnosis, but investigation found no Swedish exposure in her childhood. No Swedish neighbors, no Swedish media, no contact with Swedish speakers. Others suggested genetic memory. Perhaps linguistic information encoded in DNA passed through generations. But Laura had no Swedish ancestry. Her family tree showed no Scandinavian connections. Where would Swedish linguistic memory come from? The parsimonious explanation is fraud. Laura secretly studied Swedish and performed an elaborate hoax under hypnosis. But why? She gained no fame or money. The case remained obscure for decades, and learning historical Swedish dialect would require years of academic study. For what purpose? The Jensen case remains documented but unexplained. A woman speaking fluent Swedish she never studied. Verified by linguists. Recorded for posterity. A case of xenoglossy that resists simple explanation. Case number 2. Uttara Hutter, 1974. Nagpur, India. Uttara Hutter was a Marathi-speaking girl who suddenly began speaking Bengali. Not occasional words. Complete linguistic shift. She refused to speak Marathi. Spoke only Bengali. With fluency and correct grammar. The unusual aspect: Uttara had minimal exposure to Bengali. It wasn't spoken in her household, she hadn't studied it. Yet she spoke it fluently and naturally, as if it were her native language. She even claimed to be someone else, a Bengali woman named Sharada, from West Bengal. For weeks, Uttara lived as Sharada, spoke only Bengali, knew details about Bengali culture and locations, recognized Bengali foods and customs, behaved as a Bengali woman, not as a Marathi girl pretending, as someone genuinely from that culture. Medical and psychological examination ruled out mental illness. This wasn't dissociative identity disorder in the conventional sense. The linguistic ability was too sophisticated. Learning Bengali requires years of study. Uttara acquired it instantly. During the Sharada periods, she couldn't speak Marathi even when asked. Total linguistic replacement. Dr. Ian Stevenson, psychiatrist and reincarnation researcher, investigated the case. He verified the Bengali was genuine, recorded extensive conversations, tested her knowledge of Bengali culture and language. Uttara demonstrated fluency comparable to native speakers. The Sharada personality eventually receded. Uttara returned to speaking Marathi. The Bengali ability diminished, but during the episodes, her linguistic transformation was complete. Verified, documented, unexplained. Theories proposed include past life memory, charada being a previous incarnation whose linguistic knowledge surfaced, or dissociative disorder with inexplicable linguistic acquisition during altered states, or neurological phenomenon allowing access to linguistic information through unknown mechanisms. The Uttarahutar case is documented in medical literature, investigated by credentialed researchers. A case of sudden fluent language acquisition without corresponding learning. Xenoglossy verified but not explained. Case number 3. The Rosemary case. 1927. Blackpool, England. A young woman known as Rosemary underwent hypnotic experiments. The investigator was Frederick Wood, a school principal with interest in paranormal research. The results challenged conventional understanding of linguistic ability. Under hypnosis, Rosemary began speaking ancient Egyptian, not modern Arabic, not classical Egyptian studied in universities, an older form of the language. She wrote in hieratic script, conversed about ancient Egyptian life, used vocabulary and grammar patterns consistent with ancient Egyptian linguistic structure. The linguistic material was analyzed by Egyptologists. They confirmed the Egyptian was genuine. The grammar followed ancient patterns. The vocabulary was appropriate. The hieratic script was correctly formed. This wasn't random symbols or made-up sounds. This was actual ancient Egyptian language. Rosemary had no formal education in Egyptology, no access to Egyptian language resources. In 1920s England, Egyptian linguistic resources were limited to university specialists. Learning ancient Egyptian required years of academic study. Reading hieratic script demanded specialized training. Yet Rosemary demonstrated both under hypnosis. Skeptics immediately proposed fraud. Perhaps Rosemary secretly studied Egyptology and performed an elaborate hoax. But investigation revealed no Egyptian studies in her background, no library records, no tutors, no access to specialized linguistic resources, and learning ancient Egyptian to conversational fluency would require years even with resources. Cryptomnesia was suggested. Perhaps she'd seen Egyptian texts and subconsciously absorbed them. But passive exposure doesn't teach grammar or conversational ability. Reading about Egyptian language isn't the same as speaking it fluently. The linguistic skill demonstrated exceeded passive exposure. Some proposed the medium was channeling an ancient Egyptian entity, that the linguistic information came from a disembodied consciousness using Rosemary as a vessel. This ventures into untestable metaphysical territory, but it attempts to explain where the linguistic information originated. The Rosemary case was documented extensively. Audio recordings made. Linguistic analysis performed. The ancient Egyptian was verified by experts. How an uneducated Englishwoman spoke ancient Egyptian remains unexplained. Case number 4. Ben McMahon, 2012. Melbourne, Australia. Ben McMahon was a normal English-speaking teenager. Then a car accident, severe head trauma, 1-week coma. When he woke up, he spoke fluent Mandarin Chinese. Not basic Chinese. Fluent conversational Mandarin, with proper tones, correct grammar, extensive vocabulary. He struggled to speak English. His native language felt foreign, but Mandarin came naturally, effortlessly, as if it were his first language. The medical explanation: traumatic brain injury sometimes causes linguistic changes. Foreign accent syndrome, aphasia affecting native language. But those conditions don't typically grant fluency in a completely different language. They might alter pronunciation or vocabulary recall. They don't teach new languages. Ben had studied Mandarin briefly in high school. Basic level. Enough for simple conversations. Certainly not fluency. Yet after the injury, his Mandarin was near native. His teachers were astonished. He knew vocabulary and idioms he'd never been taught. Spoke with natural flow and appropriate cultural context. Neurologists examined him. Brain scans showed injury to language centers. But the specific damage didn't explain the Mandarin fluency. If anything, the injury should have impaired all linguistic ability. Instead, it enhanced one language while suppressing another. Theories proposed include neurological rewiring. Perhaps the trauma reorganized brain pathways, giving unusual access to dormant linguistic knowledge. Or savant syndrome triggered by injury, allowing hyperfocus on previously studied material. Or coincidental timing. The COMA allowed intensive subconscious language processing. But none fully explain the phenomenon. Ben's Mandarin exceeded his education. His English deteriorated despite it being his native language. The linguistic inversion defied normal neurological patterns. Over time, his English recovered. The Mandarin fluency diminished somewhat, but remained impressive. The injury had permanently altered his linguistic brain function, created abilities that shouldn't exist through trauma alone. The Ben McMahon case is medically documented. Brain scans, language testing, expert verification, a case of sudden linguistic ability following head trauma. The mechanism remains unclear despite medical investigation. Case number 5. Lydia Johnson, 1865. Ohio. A teenage girl named Lydia Johnson fell ill with fever. For 3 days, she was delirious. When the fever broke, she spoke Hebrew. Fluent biblical Hebrew. She conversed in Hebrew for several hours before returning to English. The case was documented by local physicians and clergy. Multiple witnesses heard her speak Hebrew. A rabbi was brought to verify the language. He confirmed it was genuine Hebrew. Grammar correct. Pronunciation accurate. She used biblical phrases and theological terminology appropriately. Lydia came from a Protestant Christian family. No Jewish connections, no Hebrew education. In 1860s, rural Ohio, access to Hebrew instruction was essentially non-existent outside Jewish communities or theological seminaries. Yet Lydia spoke fluent Hebrew during her fever. The religious interpretation was obvious to witnesses. Divine intervention. The Holy Spirit granting ability to speak in tongues as described in the New Testament. Glossolalia as religious phenomenon. But biblical glossolalia is described as ecstatic utterance, not necessarily comprehensible language. Lydia spoke verified Hebrew. Medical explanation. Fever-induced delirium causing linguistic abnormality. But delirium typically produces incoherent speech, not fluent foreign language. And where would the Hebrew linguistic information come from? The brain doesn't spontaneously generate grammatical structures it's never learned. Some proposed cryptomnesia. Perhaps Lydia had been exposed to Hebrew scripture readings and subconsciously memorized them. But witnesses reported conversation, not recitation. She responded to questions in Hebrew, generated original sentences. This requires understanding, not memorization. The case was briefly famous in religious circles, used as evidence of divine linguistic gifts, then forgotten as skepticism and scientific materialism gained cultural dominance. But the documentation remains. Multiple witnesses, clerical verification, medical records of the fever. The Lydia Johnson case represents historical xenoglossy, verified by contemporaries, a teenage girl speaking biblical Hebrew during fever. The linguistic ability disappeared with the fever, no lasting effect. But for several hours, she demonstrated fluency in a language she'd never learned. Case number 6. The Gretchen case. 1970, Mount Washington, Ohio. A woman known in literature as Dolores J. Under hypnotic regression, she began speaking German, identified herself as Gretchen Gottlieb, a German girl who lived in 19th century Germany. The German was fluent, native quality, with regional dialect. She described life in 19th century Germany with accurate cultural details, discussed foods, customs, daily life, used period-appropriate vocabulary and expressions, spoke as someone who'd actually lived in that time and place. Linguistic analysis confirmed the German was genuine, not modern standard German taught in schools. A regional variant with characteristics of 19th century Southern German dialects. The grammar was correct. The vocabulary matched the period. This was authentic historical German. Dolores J. had limited German education, high school courses decades earlier. Basic conversational German at best. Not fluency. Certainly not historical dialect. Yet under hypnosis, she spoke German that would require years of specialized study to acquire. The case was investigated by multiple researchers. Recordings made. Linguists consulted. Historians verified the cultural details Gretchen described. The information was accurate to 19th century Germany, including obscure details not commonly known. Skeptics proposed Dolores had secretly studied German history and language, prepared an elaborate performance under hypnosis, but investigation found no evidence of such study. No German tutors. No advanced language courses. No historical research in her background. The alternative explanation: past life memory. Gretchen Gottlieb was a previous incarnation. Her linguistic and cultural knowledge surfaced during hypnotic regression. This explains the accuracy and fluency, but requires accepting reincarnation as real phenomenon. Or cryptomnesia combined with linguistic savant ability. Perhaps exposure to German media triggered subconscious learning, but this doesn't explain the historical dialect and cultural accuracy. Passive exposure doesn't teach 19th century regional German. The Gretchen case remains documented. Audio recordings exist. Linguistic analysis confirms authenticity. A woman speaking fluent historical German she never formally studied. Xenoglossy verified. Mechanism debated. Case number 7. K. Reynolds, 1973. England. K. Reynolds, a British woman, developed sudden linguistic ability during meditation practice. She began speaking what she believed was Gaelic. But linguistic analysis revealed something more unusual: an extinct Celtic language. The language Kay spoke wasn't modern Irish or Scottish Gaelic. It was Old Celtic, a linguistic form not spoken in over 1,000 years. She used grammatical structures and vocabulary that modern Celtic speakers wouldn't recognize. Yet it was verified as authentic by Celtic language specialists. Kay had no Celtic studies background, no linguistics training, no exposure to Old Celtic language resources. Such resources barely existed outside academic specialist circles. Learning Old Celtic requires extensive study of ancient texts and linguistic reconstruction. It's not a living language one can study conversationally. Yet Kay spoke it fluently during her meditation states, formed grammatically correct sentences, used appropriate vocabulary, demonstrated understanding when Celtic language experts addressed her in reconstructed Old Celtic. This wasn't mimicry. This was linguistic competence. The meditation context suggested altered state consciousness accessing information beyond normal awareness. Perhaps meditation unlocked memories from a past life where Old Celtic was spoken. Or perhaps meditation enabled connection to some form of collective human linguistic knowledge. Theories ventured into metaphysics. From a neurological perspective, meditation can alter brain function, changes connectivity patterns, potentially allows access to information stored unusually in memory. But this doesn't explain information that was never learned. Kay's brain had never been exposed to Old Celtic linguistic structures. Where was the information stored? Some researchers proposed Jung's collective unconscious. Perhaps linguistic information is encoded in human consciousness at a species level. Meditation allowed Kay to access this universal linguistic archive. But collective unconscious remains unverified hypothesis. And why Old Celtic specifically? Others suggested fraud. Kay studied Old Celtic secretly and performed under pretense of spontaneous acquisition. But Old Celtic expertise is rare. Learning it would require years working with specialized academics. Kay had no such background, and she gained nothing from the claim. The K. Reynolds case was documented by researchers studying altered states of consciousness. Linguistic experts verified the Old Celtic, a woman speaking an extinct language during meditation. The linguistic ability surfaced impossibly. The explanation remains elusive. Case number 8. Foreign accent syndrome. Cluster. Multiple documented cases exist of people developing foreign accents after brain injury. But several cases transcend mere accent change. They demonstrate actual linguistic ability in the accent's language. This crosses from neurological oddity into xenoglossy territory. 2011. Oregon. A woman had a severe migraine. When it passed, she spoke with a British accent. American her whole life. Never lived abroad, but now spoke with convincing British pronunciation. More unusually, she began using British vocabulary and grammar naturally. Lift instead of elevator. Queue instead of line. As if she'd always spoken British English. This exceeded typical foreign accent syndrome. Accent change is neurological, altered motor control of speech muscles, but vocabulary and grammar are cognitive, learned patterns. The woman used British linguistic patterns she'd never been taught. 2013. Australia. A man suffered stroke, recovered speaking with French accent. Never studied French, but he began understanding spoken French. could follow French conversations, responded appropriately when addressed in French. This went beyond accent to comprehension. 2015, North Carolina. A woman woke from surgery speaking with Eastern European accent, but more remarkably, she began writing in what appeared to be Cyrillic script. She'd never studied Russian or any Slavic language, yet produced written characters matching Cyrillic letters. Neurologists were baffled. These cases suggest foreign accent syndrome sometimes includes deeper linguistic changes, not just pronunciation, but comprehension, vocabulary, even writing systems. As if the neurological injury doesn't just alter speech motor control, but reorganizes linguistic processing itself. The medical explanation attempts to account for these patterns. Brain injury damages language centers. Reorganization during recovery follows unusual neural pathways, perhaps creating connections to dormant linguistic information or universal language processing centers. But this doesn't explain how the brain accesses linguistic information it never learned. British vocabulary, the American woman never studied. French comprehension, the Australian man never acquired. Cyrillic script, the North Carolina woman never saw. These cases are medically documented: brain scans, neurological exams, expert verification. People developing linguistic abilities after brain injury, abilities that exceed their previous education and exposure. Foreign accent syndrome that ventures into genuine linguistic acquisition. Case number 9. The Sharada alternate personality. 1979. India. Building on the earlier Uttara Huddar case, researchers documented another instance of spontaneous Bengali linguistic ability in a non-Bengali speaker. This case involved even more detailed verification and longer-lasting episodes. A young woman experienced dissociative episodes where she became Sharada, a Bengali personality. During these episodes, which could last weeks, she spoke only Bengali. Fluent, natural, with regional accent and cultural knowledge. She couldn't speak her native language at all during Sharada episodes. What made this case exceptional was the duration and consistency. Unlike brief episodes or hypnotic states, Sharada episodes lasted extended periods. Researchers had time for extensive linguistic testing. They verified vocabulary, grammar, idioms, cultural references, all authentic Bengali, all beyond the woman's education. Sharada described life in specific Bengali locations, named villages and landmarks, described cultural practices specific to Bengal. When taken to West Bengal, she recognized locations she'd never visited in her primary personality, navigated areas she'd never seen, as if she'd lived there. Psychiatrists examined her extensively. This wasn't schizophrenia or typical dissociative identity disorder. The alternate personality was too consistent, too culturally specific, too linguistically sophisticated. Creating such a detailed alternate personality consciously would require years of research and language study. The researchers proposed past life memory. Sharada was a previous incarnation. Her memories and linguistic knowledge surfaced during dissociative episodes. This explained the authenticity and consistency, but required accepting reincarnation as explanatory framework. Alternative explanation: cryptomnesia combined with savant linguistic ability. Perhaps the woman had been exposed to Bengali culture as a child, created elaborate alternate personality incorporating that exposure. But investigation found minimal childhood Bengali exposure, nothing explaining the fluency and cultural depth. The Sharada case represents extensive documentation of xenoglossy, multiple researchers, extended observation periods, linguistic verification, cultural accuracy. A woman speaking fluent Bengali during dissociative episodes, demonstrating knowledge and ability impossible through her education. Documented but not definitively explained. Case number 10. The latent language emergence. 2016, Wales. A British teenager suffered severe head trauma in motorcycle accident, week-long coma. Upon waking, she spoke fluent Welsh. The unusual factor: she'd never spoken Welsh consciously before. But investigation revealed complexity. Her grandmother spoke Welsh. She'd been exposed to Welsh as a very young child. Then the family moved. She grew up speaking only English. No Welsh education, no conscious Welsh memory. By adolescence, she'd forgotten she'd ever heard Welsh. The head trauma appeared to unlock those dormant childhood memories. The Welsh linguistic foundation, laid in early childhood, surfaced after injury. She spoke fluent Welsh despite having no conscious memory of ever learning it. The childhood exposure had been absorbed and retained subconsciously. This case differs from pure xenoglossy. She had been exposed to Welsh, but the exposure occurred before conscious memory formation, and she demonstrated fluency beyond what brief early childhood exposure should provide. The injury had somehow given her access to linguistic information absorbed decades earlier. Neurologists proposed childhood language exposure creates permanent neural pathways, even if not consciously accessed for years. Brain injury can reorganize neural networks, potentially reactivating dormant pathways. This woman's childhood Welsh surfaced through unusual neurological reorganization. This suggests human linguistic capacity is more complex than realized. That early exposure creates lasting structures, even without conscious retention. That languages learned and seemingly forgotten aren't truly lost. They're stored in neural networks that might be reactivated through trauma or altered consciousness. The Welsh case represents a bridge between xenoglossy and neurological explanation, not pure spontaneous linguistic ability, but linguistic capacity emerging from subconscious storage, demonstrating that human language processing involves mechanisms operating below conscious awareness. Medical literature documents similar cases. Bilingual children who stop using one language. Decades later, the dormant language resurfaces spontaneously, suggesting linguistic information is permanently encoded neurologically even when not consciously accessible.